So we're up to lesson 5. Wow. This is a really important one as far as it's actually portfolio building. So like I say, I don't do much with my investments at all, but the one thing I do pay attention to, and it's the most important thing, especially if, like even if you have a financial advisor, to check that your financial advisor is doing a good job with asset allocation. As I said, I started doing these classes way back in the turn of the century it was. and it was like we had these bear markets and so many people had financial advisors, and we had back in the 90s, we had such a roaring bull market that people got very complacent about what they were doing and watching how much they had in the stock market and the bond market. It seemed too good to pass up those returns where we're averaging over 20% a year. And I mean, bonds were only returning 5 and 6%. And so why invest in those? And everybody had asset allocations that were just crazy. And they got smeared by that bear market of 2000. You really have to pay attention to asset allocation. So we're going to talk a lot about that. But before I do, a couple of questions that I was asked over the last couple of weeks, if I could cover them. One is, and I wanted to do this anyway, ETFs. So you may have had a financial advisor that said to you, well, why don't you go into ETFs? And I'm a big advocate of don't invest in anything if you don't understand how it works. So I'm going to attempt to explain an ETF to you. I think eventually you're going to see ETFs in company retirement plans. I think they just exploded in popularity. So you really need to understand them because someone might be telling you about these, but you need to understand how they work. So an ETF is basically an index. So the index that I always talk about is the total stock market index fund. But probably in company retirement plans, the one that most amateurs are familiar with is the S&P 500. So I'll use that as an example to give you, to explain to you the difference between the S&P 500 index fund and SPY, which is a ticker symbol for the ETF of the S&P 500. So this would be the ETF. And ETF stands for Exchange Traded Fund. And this would be the Total Stock Market Index Fund. Say at Vanguard. That's a bad circle, but we'll live with it. Okay, so going back to when I explained how index funds work, is basically inside of here are all the stocks that compose of the stock market. When you put money in, let's say, I don't know what the share price of the Total Stock Market Index Fund today is, but we'll say it's $10. So if you send $100 to it at the close of the business day today, if the NAV, that's the share price, net asset value, and remember this net asset value is determined by the value of the assets inside of it divided by the share price, so a number of shares outstanding. So you're taking all these stocks. So if this S&P 500, you take those 500 companies, you multiply it times the share price, you get a thing, and how many shares you have, you multiply it, you divide that out, and you find out what the net asset value is. So every day, the net asset value will reflect the value of, in other words, if you took all the shares of the total stock market or the S&P 500 index fund at Vanguard at close today, and you multiplied it times the share price, you would have the value of the assets inside of it. So you're always going to get fair value. And when the assets change in value, the share price goes up and down with it. It has nothing to do with the money going into it. Because new money that comes into it, you send $100, the $100 will be added to this, and then 10 new shares will be created. So there's always that balance. You got that? Another thing about the index fund, which I I prefer index funds versus ETFs, and this is one of the major reasons why, and I'll get into that, is there's regulations and laws that oversee mutual funds. When you invest in mutual funds, you are protected. Well, basically the biggest one is the Investment Act of 1949. So what that means is no financial company that this mutual fund is with can take assets from there if they go bankrupt or run into financial problems or anything like that. That is, you are protected by law. So we ran into situations back in the financial crisis where people had money with Lehman Brothers in brokerage accounts, and Lehman Brothers was selling assets to pay off their bills from people's accounts. So you're protected with these, and you'll always know that when the price of the assets move up and down, that is going to be reflected directly, equally in the share price. There's no disparity between the value of the assets and the shares. Got that? Now, we go to ETFs. With ETFs are basically indexed to it's the S&P 500, but the company that creates the ETF creates a finite number of shares. So there might be a float of 10 million shares when it's first offered. And they may also have a share price of $10. So basically, the day that ETF is created, the value of the assets inside of it are equal to the share price. You know, there's not a difference. But once that ETF goes public, it trades as a stock. In other words, new shares aren't available. So if you want it, you have to buy the shares from someone else. In other words, the ETF doesn't constantly create new shares. So basically, it trades just like a company's stock does. So it does have a management fee, just like so Vanguard's are the same. The management fee is the same for the ETF as that, and that covers the management of the investment product itself. So basically, the share price doesn't necessarily reflect the value of the assets inside of it. I mean, it has to a relative basis, but there can be a discrepancy. There's an experiment that was done many years ago, which was extremely unpopular, where financial companies tried to do this with mutual funds. They're called closed-end mutual funds, where they created a mutual fund and then they traded it like a stock. And basically, there's big disparities between the value of the assets inside of it because there just wasn't demand for it. And so the share price kept going down, even though the assets inside of it were worth way more, because there was not demand for it. So when they created ETFs, they didn't want to replicate the unattractiveness of closed-end mutual funds, and so they created a mechanism to arbitrage the share price and the assets inside of it. And this arbitrage vehicle is called an authorized participant. The authorized participant is some, assuming big financial institution, lots of money, bank, I don't know what it is, but all ETFs have an authorized participant. So what they do is the authorized participant pays attention to if there's a disparity between the value of the assets inside of it and the share price. So what I'm saying is you could get in a very volatile day, and maybe like this would be down 10%. Well, the assets inside of here would be down 10%. But the people who own this ETF, they just want to get out at any price. And so there's way more selling than there is buyers for this. And it could go down 20% because it trades like a stock. There's a limited number of shares. So the authorized participant steps in, injects liquidity into the ETF. In exchange, they get something called creation units. So the closest metaphor I could use to that would be a company issues a certain number of shares. And then as an incentive to management, they will give them stock options. Those stock options basically are not part of the float that's being traded every day, right? The executives at some time in the future can exercise their options, and then they become shares and stuff like that, but they're not part of the float until they exercise the option. Well, with this, the authorized participant injects liquidity into that to get this back in line, and then when there's times when the value of the assets inside the share price actually becomes higher than the value of the assets in it, then they cash in those creation units and get shares back in return, and then they can sell those or hold them or whatever. See what I'm saying? It's an arbitrage thing. So to make a long story short, this is the reason why I would prefer using a mutual fund to an ETF, considering I'm using the total stock market index fund. Because ETFs, yeah, they've been around for 10 or 15 years, but they went from being a small thing as far as the money invested into them to, I bet you there's close to $1 trillion in ETFs now. So that means there has to be the financial liquidity to back up trillions of dollars of investments. We haven't been into a 50% decline for quite a while. If we get into a really nasty bear market, is there going to be the liquidity on the part of those authorized participants to make ETFs whole? And I'll bet you if you're owning an ETF of the total stock market index fund and the stock market is down 49% and your ETF is down 60% because the authorized participant can't provide the liquidity, you're going to get the heck out of it. And what's that going to do to the disparity? It's going to create it even. In other words, I could see panic. I could see a situation where, in a very stressful thing. And yet, this is the interesting thing. I have never once heard an article or seen an article on Wall Street Journal or Barron's or anything. Nobody questions this. It reminds me of nobody questioned mortgages back, the derivatives that banks were creating for mortgages and all that. Nobody ever questioned that. You know, like, what are they going to work when the mortgage market's under stress? Until all of a sudden it happened, then they go, oh, God, we didn't see that coming. So when someone asks me, should I use an ETF of the total stock market index fund or S&P 500 or the index fund, I'm going with the index fund because I don't want to have anything to do with that, the risk associated with that. What are the benefits of an ETF over the index fund? It's not cost. It's really not tax efficiency. What it is, number one, there's a boatload of different ETFs or indexes of so many different things. So, like, there's ETFs of biotech companies, of semiconductors, probably AI now. You can, all these different subsectors, what you can do is, rather than trying to buy just one biotech company, you could buy an ETF that has the 20 top biotechs. You see what I mean? So they're attractive that way, but, you know, and the other thing is, and it's a big selling point of ETFs, is you can sell them basically 24 hours a day. You can short them if you want to short them. And for people that don't know what that means, is you can make bets on them going down. And you make money when they go down. So they're very tradable, just like a stock. That means nothing to me. In other words, if I want to get my money out of the total stock market index fund, I am more than comfortable with calling Vanguard, and I'll know at 3 o'clock that day it's going to get sold and the money is going to go into my money market account. You know what I mean? I don't need to have it done right at that instant. You know, that's the difference between the two. And for my opinion is I will stick to the index fund. Any questions on that? Didn't think so, because you're probably more confused. Hey, I mean, seriously, I had to read over and over and over again because they're extremely, they are complicated. And when I started understanding how they worked, it really, I could see the risk, and I could see the parallel to what happened in the mortgage market, you know? So anyway, to me, it's not worth the risk. The other thing that was asked to me is, what do I think of annuities? Well, I guess the best metaphor I can think of that is, what do I think of a porta potty on a 90-degree day? Not a big fan of annuities. I mean, I'm sure there's cases where an annuity is a viable option, but once again, if you've attended any of my classes or you've attended this class so far, you understand that I think one of the most important things about investing is being and knowing what you're paying. And with annuities, there's so many multiple layers of expenses. I just got this from Money Magazine a long time ago, and it gave kind of like an idea of the multiple layers of expenses. I mean, I've had people that told me, "Oh, my annuity is great. I mean, all I get charged is like $10 a year." They get some fee for $10 a year, and they think that's the expenses of it. Don't be that naive, please. There's multiple layers. Well, first of all, big selling point of annuities is, well, you can't lose any money in them. But did you ever read the fine print of all the conditions you have to meet so that you don't lose that money? You can't take it out ahead of time. You have to keep it in there for, I mean, some annuities up to 12 years. Well, I mean, if I was a younger person, I pretty much could take somebody's money, and if they gave me 12 years to work for it, and you couldn't take the money out for that 12 years, I pretty much could give you that guarantee that you're not going to lose money over 12 years too. I mean, you saw that, that what I talked about. Anyway, what are some of these fees? So, annuities grow tax deferred because they're an insurance product. That's what gives them that like umbrella in the tax laws, in which your money can compound and grow annually without paying taxes. But stop and think about it. With an annuity, the money you put in is after-tax dollars. And then all the growth, you have to pay the taxes when you take it out. To me, a Roth IRA is a much better approach because it's after-tax dollars, but all the growth inside after that is 100% tax-free. So why wouldn't you go to a Roth IRA first over an annuity? Well, the answer is because I could lose money in a Roth. Well, this lesson's on asset allocation. If you know anything about asset allocation and you do it right, you pretty much can negate a lot of that risk of losing money if you're given time. So let's just run down some of these expenses. So the insurance charge is called the mortality and risk expense. And so the average typical is 1.35% per year. This is from Morningstar. Back when I made it, I don't know if the fees have gone up since I made this or down. My estimate is they haven't gone down. Okay, investments with annuities. So when you put it into an annuity, then the insurance company comes, and it's just like a mutual fund. Then they have to have investment people that invest it. So we went through all the expenses. You got the management fee, you got the transaction costs, we got all those expenses. And remember, in reality, you would take this, because if this mutual fund had an expense ratio of 0.95, I said, Money Magazine says multiply that times 3 when you include all the other expenses associated with it. So this is only shows you 0.95, but in actuality it could be, after all the hidden expenses, could be much higher. Then you have riders and options. The average is around 0.65. So total annual expenses around 3%, but yeah, you'd be lucky if it. So think of the difference. Invest your money for 3% costs a year, and it's going to be higher because obviously the expenses of the investments products themselves have more expenses. Or you could set up a portfolio and use indexes, and you have expenses of 4/100ths of 1%. I mean, at the start of every year, the annuity is almost 3% behind you. So compound that annually. If you live another 20 years after you get the annuity, how are you going to catch up? It's just, I'm telling you, over the years, I've had so many people who have, talked to me about they're in these annuities and all that kind of stuff. So one out you do have is you can actually move an annuity. So if you've been sold an annuity and you obviously it's performing poorly and you want to lower the expenses, Vanguard does have low-cost annuities. I mean, I think you can get an annuity for 1% or less, all these expenses included. You can use a total stock market index fund in it and all that. So you actually can do a transfer. It's not that hard. So you can transfer it just like you can transfer an IRA. So usually the question that when people ask me about it, the first thing you need to do is, how many years do you have before you've gotten rid of that surrender charge? So let's say you have 5 more years. So the surrender charge is 5%. So just do the math. If you're spending 3% a year and you can drop that down to 1%, you could save 2% a year. So if you're in there, if you got 5 more years, you could pay it off and come out ahead by doing it at that time. So it's one of those things that you don't have to necessarily bite the bullet, but you'd have to do the math on what's best for you. And when you do transfer them, there's no taxes involved in that because it's just an exchange. You're not getting rid of the annuity. So any questions about that? Something else I was thinking about, but on the annuities. I mean, I helped someone do that once, and it wasn't that hard. The forms are pretty easy. And you can actually choose the investments. So at Vanguard, they have like the total stock market index as one, and they have like the short-term investment grade bond fund and the total bond index as choices. So you can choose really low-cost products to put in the annuity. And they have different kinds of annuities too. The more guarantees you got, the more expenses, of course, are going along with it. But I don't believe their annuities have surrender charges on them either. I mean, that's what I was thinking about. Why in the world, this is another cornerstone of, I think, of investing, is why in the world would you put your money into an investment where you're penalized for getting your money out? I mean, why would you do that? Especially if you're going into retirement years. Because you go into retirement years, I'm telling you, you're not working anymore. And all of a sudden when you got all your money tied up in annuities, and all of a sudden your roof is, the insurance company says, you got to put a new roof on here or we're going to drop your insurance. And you find out it's going to cost $12,000 or $15,000 to do your roof, and you got to take it out of the annuity, but then you're going to get penalized for taking it out of the annuity because you got to keep it in there for 12. Why would you put yourself in that position? You understand what I'm saying? And the other thing that goes along with annuities that are sold by certain financial people, which I think are also something I don't care, and I have some real personal experience with this, are life insurance policies sold as investments. I was a young, naive guy. Of course, I guess I have an out. I wasn't really that dumb. When I first started working and created my business, I was looking for places to invest tax efficiently. And we didn't have IRAs yet. You didn't have company retirement plans. I couldn't create a SEP or anything like that. And so my mother says to me one day, boy, I was reading about these single premium life insurance policies. All you have to do is put the money into them, and then you don't have to put any more money into them, and then you let them grow, and then when you retire, they'll grow to a certain amount, and then you can borrow money from them, and you don't have to pay any taxes on them. Well, I thought I died and went to heaven. This has got to be the best thing ever. I can invest it. It's going to grow, no taxes while it grows, and then when I want to quit working, I can just borrow the money from it, and I don't have to pay it back, and it's like there's no taxes. Well, did I find out that was a load of you-know-what. Because, okay, so this is back, and I remember the date because they were going to do changing some laws on these things. It was 1986. And like the ignorant person I was, and this is another learn, if you do something speculative and you don't really understand it, don't put a whole lot of money in it. And at this time, it was a lot of money to me. I just didn't buy one of them. Remember, I'm a single guy, so what do I need life insurance for anyway? But anyway, that's another story. But didn't really need life insurance. But no, I didn't put $19,000 into one. These were so great, I had to buy two of them. Okay, so they kept growing, and I was working, and I didn't need them, and I had my investments and stuff like that. I just ignored them, and they did exactly what the insurance guy told me. Yeah, I get statements, and oh gee, I was collecting X number. See, they paid a certain amount of interest, and from the interest you paid the premium, and then what was ever left was gone into cash value for me. You got it, how it works? So year after year after year, it kept growing and growing and growing. And so when I quit working, and I had them there, but I thought, I really don't need these because I have other investments and stuff like that. I'll just let them grow. And then after a while, it got to be, I'm going like, well, like, I don't have to pay any taxes on these things. Why not just take $5,000 here, $5,000 there, and then, that reduces the money I have to take out of investments. It'll reduce my tax rate. So I kind of used them as a tax tool. You know what I mean? It's like whatever capital gains, interest, and stuff I had that year, I didn't have to sell things because I could take 5 here and 5 there. So to make a long story short, I probably took about $15,000 from one policy and $10,000 from another policy. And then after that, I didn't really need to take anything. I was managing my investments enough where they were tax efficient, and so I just didn't think I didn't need to do that anymore. And I just forgot about them. All of a sudden, about 10 years later, I get a notice from the first company saying that if I didn't start paying premiums on these, the policy would be terminated, and I would be liable for all the distributions on that policy, including the distributions that went back to paying the premium on it. So I put $19,000 into it. I took $15,000 out, and I had something like an $80,000 or $90,000 tax bill if I didn't start paying premiums. Oh, well, that was the taxable obligation, so that's not the full tax. I'd have to pay whatever my tax rate is. So I bit the bullet, terminated the policy, and paid the taxes that year. Then the other one, I contacted them, and they said, well, based on that, you could live to be 88 years old with the money you have in there, and it won't be terminated. And I said, well, if I don't do that, and I just let it grow, and I do get to 88 years old, and I stop paying the terminate, and the thing gets terminated, I don't pay the premiums, which obviously, what are the premiums on an 80-year-old for life insurance? It was going to be $320,000 of taxable gain for me as income. So I bit the bullet on that. So when you guys go home and you say, gee, we made really bad choices sometimes in our investments, or you did something wrong, do you think, I've never done that? I mean, I was just in my 20s. I didn't know any better. And it's things like that motivated me to learn about these things. And so don't invest in something that's complicated and you really don't know how it works. You know what I mean? The sales pitch was fantastic. It was fantastic, very professional. But underneath, I should have known better the day I gave him the money, and he gave me back this booklet that was like that thick of all the information regarding this particular product. There must have been a catch there, you know what I mean? Unfortunately, the fortunate thing is I had the money to pay for it. It didn't kill me financially. I just looked at it as a lesson learned, and you know what? I love sharing stories of my idiot stuff. I'm not one of these that only brags about the good stuff. So everybody has made mistakes, and that's what this class is all about, to try to help you to avoid making some of those mistakes, okay? So life insurance policies are great. Term life insurance, great idea, but as an investment, very costly, and there's a lot of red tape on it. And this idea that you can just borrow infinitely from them and you'll never have any tax obligations, read the fine print, because it could turn around and really bite you, okay? All right, let's get to asset allocation. So your homework when you go home, sometime this week coming up, is you must sit down. And you can do it on your computer, you can create a spreadsheet, or just get the old notebook out. I love just pencil and paper, old school. And what you do is you draw a line down the middle. And you go fixed income over here, and then you go the equities. And you get an idea of what is called your asset allocation. These are the assets in asset allocation, fixed income and equities. It is shocking how little people pay attention to the money that they have in the various assets. And it's crucial in determining the outcome of what you're doing as an investor. So what do you do as fixed income? So on the fixed income side, the cash that you have in the bank, the cash that you have in money market accounts, the cash that you have in CDs, that goes over here on fixed income. If you have this is kind of a quasi thing, but if you have rental property, this is kind of like I would put it over here, and you're collecting interest on rent from people. That would be kind of figuring out that's part of your fixed income portfolio. The bonds that you have, if you have short-term, intermediate, long-term bonds, and if you have what's called a balance fund. So if you have what's called a balance fund, most balance funds are either 50% in the stock market, 50% in bonds, but most of them are 60% in the stock market and 40% bonds. So you're going to have to take the amount you have in it and do the math and break it down. But it's imperative that you get an idea of how much you have on the fixed income side. So that includes your brokerage accounts, that includes your IRAs, that includes your company retirement plans. And if you're a husband and wife, talk to each other. You know, like, this is a team effort here. You know, your wife is doing one thing, you're doing it, you don't have no idea. You're a team in the long run. As my wife constantly reminds me, I don't have an IRA, we have an IRA. So fixed income, and then on the other side is equities. So any stock market things, growth, value funds, small cap, big cap, large cap, index funds. If you have a brokerage account, individual stocks. But coordinate between the two so you have an idea of your asset allocation. It's so, so important. And most people don't do that. And I'm always shocked at how many times the wife doesn't tell the husband. I mean, they just don't know what the two of them have. You know what I mean? It's like you got to have it together, especially in retirement planning. When you're younger, it doesn't matter too much. You're going to see by asset allocation, you can pretty much be all in the stock market. It doesn't matter, but especially as you get close to retirement and in retirement, you're going to see the benefits of having smart asset allocation. As I said, it's really important, and research says that when you look at the percentage of the portfolio movement over time is explained by, it's basically over 90% of the movement of your portfolio is due to asset allocation, and roughly only like 9% due to security selection. It's amazing. So, what are the fundamentals of asset allocation? The three interacting fundamentals are the need to take risk. Whereas in investing, to have growth, you need to take risk. But then, what is your tolerance for risk? So when someone says to me, like, I can't sleep at night. I mean, it's my investments, they drive me absolutely insane. Well, one of the things that you need to understand is, as human beings, we all have risk tolerances. I've always been more on the conservative side in investing. I mean, this goes back to when I first started. The idea of seeing high volatility with what I was doing, it bothered me. It bothered me because I had a business, and I wouldn't want to run my business taking all that risk. So if you're going to be a smart businessman, you want to make sure, especially small business, you want to make sure that you have enough money in the bank that if something really happens, that you have something to fall back on, that you're not running your budget right on the edge, expecting perfection day after day after day, and that there's going to be no stresses, because that's what puts small businesses under. They run too much risk. So in investing, you have to have a tolerance for risk, and I understand that. But the thing that I've learned is the more educated you are, the more information you have about investing, the more tolerant you become for risk. It is amazing with the recessions that we had in the 2000s, the 2000, 2008, didn't emotionally bother me at all. I didn't lose one iota of sleep. Now, how did I tolerate it? Well, one of the ways to tolerate it is don't look at your statements. Seriously, I'm not telling you to do that, but this is what I do. I'm fully aware that the stock market really is tanking. And I'm fully aware that the assets that I have in the stock market reflect the stock market. So if the stock market is down 40%, bingo, my investments in that stock market are down 40%. There is nothing I can do about it. So what do? You look at history. I look at my asset allocation. In other words, I'm investing and I'm prepared, much like I ran my business. If the stock market dropped 50% tomorrow, I would be all right. Because I have assets, enough in fixed income, to get me through what history says is the maximum time that we've ever had really bad markets. I can get through it. That gives me the tolerance for it. It really does, my asset allocation and the quality of investments I have. If you're in high yield bonds, if you're in junk bonds, if you're in like long-term bonds, if you're in like these AI stocks, if you're in all kinds of really aggressive stuff on the stock market side, all the data I show you about volatility associated with asset allocation, throw it out the window because it doesn't really mean anything, because those assets have much more volatility than what I teach in this class. So I have history on my side telling me the variations of volatility associated with what I'm doing. And I have that peace. And because I have that peace, I have a higher tolerance. But I'm still 50-50. Because to me, the only reason I would change my asset allocation to 75 or 80% in the stock market, it would be greed. And going back to my first lesson, I have enough. So why would I want to risk it? I am doing awesome with a balanced portfolio. I cannot believe the statements I get, and I look. And I'm thinking, like, why would I even think about taking more risk for just a little bit more? It's not worth it. So, the second thing is your tolerance for risk. So, create an asset allocation, not just that, yeah, you need to take risk, but get an asset allocation that fits your tolerance for risk. And then your investment time horizon. That is so important. When you're young, you have a tremendous amount of human capital, you have jobs, you're working, you can let your investments go because you're not living on them. But once you get to within 5 years of retirement, once you get in retirement, when you're living on there, your time horizon has just expired as far as the ability to just let investments grow and not have to touch them. Now you have to touch them because you need income. So I meet people that, I remember one guy, I don't know where he worked, but he had like a pension of $90,000 a year. So he said, well, why do I need a balanced portfolio? Because we don't even, we're investors yet. Because my pension, and then I got Social Security too, is like, we're not spending that money, so I'm actually an investor, so why don't I have a higher asset allocation and invest like 70 or 80% in the stock market? And I said, sure, I mean, based on the fact that, you don't really, you have the assets, you can tolerate more risk, but why are you doing that? Well, then I'm going to have more money. But you already have as much money and more than you need coming in already, so you're going to have a higher asset allocation just because you want. Is this a race? Is this? Are you in a contest here? Are you going to get an award when you die because you got more money than someone else? It's just, to me, these are all questions that everyone individually has to ask. But remember these three things. Okay, so getting at the whole risk. So the amount of risk, the reward you get for bearing the ups and the positive gains you for taking risk is the reward for the ups and downs of the stock market. And the more risk you take, the more potential gain there is. That's basic economics. But then there's a safety penalty. So the amount you lose for each year when you avoid risk. So my fixed income in my fixed income investments, basically historically, you're talking 5 to 6% average return. Stock market, somewhere around 10. So that means that there's risk to these, but it's probably almost 50% less than the risk of the stock market. You know, you can't, you're still taking risk. But there's a penalty if you take all this and you just put it into, like, cash at 3%. Because if you got it cash at 3%, and the inflation rate is 3%, long term, you know, you're just going to lose a lot of money. You're going to eat up your money because inflation and what you're spending is going to eat it up. This chart kind of gives you an idea of what the penalty is for not taking risk. So if you took stocks with an average return of 10%, bonds with an average return of 5%, savings with an average return of 3%, and you took $10,000 and you just invested it for basically, 40 years. Okay, compounded the stock market, $10,000 over 40 years would compound at 10%, would compound out to $452,000. If you took the $10,000 and said, I don't want to take the risk of the stock market, I'm just going to fixed income and high-quality bonds, and you average 5% with your money, it grows to $80,000. Think about that. If you put it in cash at the bank and you make 3%, your $10,000 compounds out to $30,000. The penalty, same amount of time, same amount of money, but look at the penalty for not taking risk. It's incredible. So you need to take risk. And so when can you take it? Go back to that time horizon. The longer time you have, where you don't have to touch the money, the more risk. And that's how you develop asset allocation models. Now, if you look about risk, this is 1926 to 2008. On a one-year basis, this gives you the range of the volatility of money and of our stock market. It's been up almost 50%. It's been down almost 50%. I mean, you have like 100% range on any given year in returns on the stock market. Bonds, it's narrower. Cash, you never had a negative year, but then you move 5 years out. Look at how this morphs down. Time reduces volatility. Then you stretch it out to 10 years, and basically, you know, you've never had a 10-year period where you have negative returns putting money in the stock market from 1926 to 2008. You think about S&P 500. On a one-year basis, the S&P 500, 1926 to 2002, the S&P 500 advances 70% of the time and declines 30% of the time. So on a one-year basis, you have so people ask me this question all the time. I got $10,000 to invest. When should I invest it? The best time to invest in the stock market is when you got the $10,000. You can't time it. You just use statistics. Because once you go to 5 years, the probability of your money advancing is 90%. So when somebody asks that question, what they're thinking is, they're thinking on a day-to-day basis or week-to-week basis. Investing is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And so think of 5 years. And on a 10-year basis, 97% of the time, your money advances. So it's just, you know, you have to understand it is a game of risk. But you get that tolerance when you look at it with time and you understand history. It gives you that more tolerance. As human beings, one of our attributes is called recency bias. I mean, talk to a girl in high school. She's got a boyfriend. Ah, the world is wonderful. She's in love. I mean, everything is really great. And then there's the breakup. Oh, yeah, my world is falling apart. I mean, the highs and lows. It's just the recency bias. The only thing changed is, teen romance changed. But we are all subject to these things. As investors, you get into a bad year, and people think it's going to last forever. Go back to what history says. And actually comfort yourself with the maximum point of financial opportunity is when the stock market is down 40 or 45%. Really. If you have money to invest, that is the time to get it in. But nobody wants to, because they're suffering from recency bias. They've just experienced a 40% decline. Are you nuts? Okay? So, some more history. 1926 to 2013. A portfolio with 100% in stocks. You had a high one-year gain of 54.2. Average is 10.2. And the worst was down 43.1%. You kick it down to 10% bonds and 90% stocks, and you gave up about 4%. Your total return, average return, dropped just negligibly, and your downside a little less. So this would be like a young person. This would be a young person who has a lot of time. This is what you go for. Then you take an asset allocation of 80% bonds and only 20% stocks, and you can see the difference is you go from the highs around 30%. And I actually, when I made this chart, I was pretty shocked because that's a pretty darn good year. Okay? Your average is 6.7, and your worst was negative 10. 90% bonds, 10% stocks. You can see it's like you just reduce volatility, but the average return doesn't get terribly affected. And that's why when someone asks me, they're maybe in their 80s, keep 20% in the stock market, 25% in the stock market, because it'll help in that average return. You know what I mean? I love to share this story because when I was doing this class, there was a young couple that attended, and they came up after class and introduced themselves to me and asked if they could come over to my house and talk to me about their investments. And I was quite impressed with them because they were probably about 28 at the time, and they had already accumulated a pretty good amount between the two of them in their company retirement plans and in different investments. And they were it was such a rude awakening what they learned in the class about investing and using index funds and reducing expenses and stuff like that. They really did take it to heart. And they changed the way they invested, and they simplified their portfolio, and they started using the stuff like the total stock market index fund and the bond funds and stuff like that. And, over the years, a couple of years later, they had their first kid, then they had another kid, and life goes on. And they always stayed in touch. Well, she emailed me one day, or sent to Facebook, or I don't know how, but anyway, she sent me this message talking about her great-grandma. Okay, so her great-grandma was in her 80s. And great-grandma had some money in the bank, and like CDs and stuff like that. And you know how interest rates were really low, and so she was only making like 1 or 2%. So great-grandma says to Sarah, you keep talking about how well you're doing in this, like this total stock market index fund. Why don't I take some of that money out of the bank and I'll put it in the total stock market index fund? And Sarah's sister, oh, great grandma, I don't know. You could probably put it in there, and then all of a sudden it could go down 20 or 30%. You just keep it in the bank. Keep it in that. You're getting the 1%. You're 80 years old. It's just like, keep it there. And she'd go, okay. Okay, then 10 years go by. And she said to Sarah, I still got that money in the bank. What do you think about me putting some of that in that total stock market index fund? And Sarah goes, I don't know. And she says, this is what you told me 10 years ago. But anyway, the point is I guess, it's like you never know what your total time horizon is. But even as you age, it's a good idea to keep some of it in the stock market, because if the alternative is to only make 1 or 2%, you need to have something for growth. But it was really funny because she said, well, that's what you told me 10 years ago. So, a random walk down Wall Street, Burton McKeel kind of said that he looked at history. And so if your financial goal is just to get an average of 5%, you could probably do that with a portfolio of just bonds. But you showed what happens. If you're a young person and you invest $10,000, it grew to $80,000 instead of $400 and some thousand dollars. But, you can accomplish that. But to get to where we want, between 9 and 11%, you need to have portfolios with 60 to 80% in the stock market. The more you have in, the more potential average return you're going to get. But what is the price you pay? So if your tolerance for loss is 20%, that is a balanced portfolio. So I'm telling you, that's historical data, probably includes the Depression in there. But personally, the bond funds I used at Vanguard and the total stock market index fund, which I was between 2000, that recession, and the stock market had a negative return of 49%, both those in 2000, 2008, I never was down 20% with the investments I used, using the total stock market index and the bond fund. Because the bond funds did extremely well to offset the 49% that was on. So your losses, if you're in the 90% in the stock market, your loss potential is 40 to 50%. That's what history says. But as I said, if you're a young person and you have a company retirement plan, my advice is you can look at your monthly statements. Don't look at it every day. You will become a financial hypochondriac. It worries me every time someone talks to me about their investments and said, yesterday my bond fund was down 3 cents. I mean, what's going on? Or their stock market, last month my portfolio was down $10,000. This is what investments do. Just pay attention to it from afar. And when things are going good, you'll know it because the news media will be talking about the stock market. And you can look at your statements and say, oh, isn't this great? But when the you-know-what hits the fan, if you know you have quality investments and you know you have the proper asset allocation, my advice is don't look at it. It just goes right to the shredder. Because I don't need to look at it. I don't need to see that number. It's like you're going down the highway, and there's a terrible crash on the other side of the highway. What does everybody do? And then they complain they have nightmares because they saw something really terrible. If the person over there, if they need help, then you want to be there for them. But if you see the police are there and that, just keep your eye on the road. Say, this is terrible. We don't need to see something really gruesome. It's the same thing with investing. Okay. there's a correlation to volatility and returns. So if you're in like investments where there's a lot of volatility, like standard deviation, and what they did is they looked at mutual fund investors and the returns investors got and the correlation to the volatility in those mutual funds. So here you have a standard deviation of about 15. Those funds returned 159%. But the investors in that fund, because they pulled money out and then put money back in and stuff like that, their actual return was only 136%. Jump up that to 19.5 of standard deviation. Those funds returned 146.6%. Investors only got 96% because they pulled the volatility. As it increased, they lagged by 50%. The most volatile in this study had a standard deviation of 28.2. Those funds had a total return of 205%. Average investor only returned 122.4. They underperformed the funds they were investing in by 82% because they couldn't stand the volatility of it. So, obviously, volatility gets people nervous. Nervousness creates fear. Fear is your enemy. Take a deep breath. Okay? $100,000 invested. In 2008, you had $100,000 of investments. You had a 90% stock market, 10% bond asset allocation. Okay? By January 3rd of 2009, you had dropped down to $58,956,000. Almost. I mean, that's 40-some% decline. By January 1st of 2017, 8 years later, that same asset allocation bounced back to $227,000. Imagine selling here. And I have seen this over and over and over again. People traumatized by their investments, pulling it out, putting it in the bank, and because they're so traumatized, they sit there and they wait, quote unquote, for things to get better. In the meantime, the stock market roars back, and then when it's back to $227,000 gain, now I'll put it back in at its peak. This is behavior that's repeated over and over again. Don't do that. Don't do that. But this is the volatility associated with a 90-10. We dropped down to a 50-50 mix here. You were down to 76,500. This is assuming indexing. And by 2017, it bounced back to $190,000. Tremendous bounce backs. And that's what markets do. They, especially in the early stages of bull markets, because the market is always forward-looking. And so it can look really bad as far as the economy, but the professional investors, they know that's the point. They start pouring money in, and that it turns around before necessarily the fundamentals are necessarily saying it's time. This is a stock chart I had from way long ago about asset allocation, and it was a 50-50 mix. I got this from Vanguard from 1960 to 2005. The average return at that time of 50-50 mix using indexes was 9.1. Your best year was 1995, where you had a return of 27.7. Your worst year was 1974. You had a negative return, 14.4. You had 7 years of loss. Now, I want to take an aggressive asset allocation of 100% in stocks using the same time period. Okay? The average return was 10.5. Your best year was 1975. What did I say the worst year was? 1974. So 1975, you bounced back with a 38.5% year. 1974, you were down 28.4. And you had 12 years of losses. So you see the difference? By a 50-50 mix, you reduce the years where you had negative returns by 5 over that time period. It's significant. But here's something that jumped out at me. This is asset allocation models and returns based on indexes. But if you were paying 2 or 3% a year, which you would do assuming a mutual fund had the returns of the indexes, which most, as I said, most mutual funds don't do. But say you were lucky enough to have a mutual fund that did do that. Well, a 50-50 mix, you take the 3% from here, you could have been, in other words, by lowering expenses, you could have taken a much lower asset allocation to get the return here. The other thing that's noteworthy here is this is basically a little more than 1% difference to get that lower volatility. Going back to what did I say, a 50-50 mix is downside risk is roughly 20% versus 40. You see what I'm saying here is the price you're paying using a 50-50 mix is only a 10% less total return, but you have 50% less potential volatility. That's a deal. To me, that's a win-win, especially when you're in a position where you're living on your investments. See what I'm saying here? Okay, so give you some ideas of bear markets and how long it took for them to bounce back. You have the bear market in 1956. The market was down 21.6%. It took 15 months for it to come back. 1968, we had a bear market, 36% down. It took a year and a half for it to get back. January 73, 48.2% bear market. It took almost 2 years. 76, a smaller one. 81, 25, that took about a year and a half. 87, I remember this one. I mean, I was a pretty young guy. I just started in accumulating a fair amount in my investments, and all of a sudden, in a matter of a couple of days, down 33%. And it only took 3 months, and it bounced back. Imagine if I would have panicked and took money and sat it. But I stuck it out. And this is the first real bear market that I experienced as an investor. And one of the lessons I learned, I said, I've always been more on the conservative side the way I have invested. I've never been someone that had all my money in the stock market. And back then, I had a significant amount of money in bonds and in stocks. And what I saw was, while the stock market was down to 30-some%, my bonds were just going great guns. They were way up. And that was my first experience of what happens oftentimes in bear markets. Because when you have bear markets, it means the economy is slowing down or crashing, inflation crashes, interest rates go down, and all of a sudden the share prices on bonds go up a whole bunch. It's like that negator to some of the volatility. And then you have March of 2000, 47.4% decline, and that one almost took 3 years. So there's all kinds of different ranges of how long it takes for a bear market, and you never know. So you need to go into bear markets with a proper asset allocation that you can weather it. And the other thing you need to do is, as I said, I'm very passive in managing things, but once again, I'm very vigilant about asset allocation. And this particular study chart shows you why. So you have 2 investors, and they both have $100,000. One rebalances on an annual basis. The other one just lets it go. So they start out in 1989. They each have $100,000. They're both 50-50. The first investor goes for the 10 years and does nothing, just lets it grow. So the $100,000 grows to $365,000, almost $366,000, but his asset allocation changes because stocks are roaring and bonds just are doing what they're doing. So his asset allocation changed from balanced to about 73% in the stock market, 27% in bonds. This guy stayed 50-50 because he rebalanced every year. The difference in total return between the two was roughly about $30,000. Okay, then we move to 1999 to 2002 when we have that bear market. This guy declined 17%. This guy had a decline of only 5%. Kept doing what they're doing. Fast forward to 2006. This guy now is still 66% in stocks and 34% in bonds. Has $439,000 in his portfolio. The person who stayed 50-50, rebalanced every year, kept it within that range, actually has $444,000. He has like $5,000 more than the person that didn't rebalance and was still taking more risk. Interesting how that works. So what I have done personally is I give myself a 10% range. So I let at any particular time, I let my asset allocation, if my target is 50-50, I let it meander to as high as like 58% in stocks and 42% in fixed income. But once it gets to that, I will take money out and rebalance it to get it around 50-50. Now, how do I do that? Well, my primary way is I spend it. Because I'm living on my portfolio. So I need to take money from my portfolio to pay my expenses and live. And so what I do is I look at the beginning of the year, and I look at my asset allocation, and I say, well, gee, I'm 56% stocks, 40-some% in bonds. I'll just take X amount of dollars out of the stock market, because that's probably what I'll need, and it gets me pretty close to being balanced. That's how I rebalance. I sell the stock market when it's high, and then when the reverse happens and the stock market is less and the bond market is more than 50%, I'll take it out of bonds. That's just how I do it. If you're in a situation where you don't need to be taking money, then just do the figuring, and you don't have to do it like, oh my God, I have to watch this all the time. It's kind of like watching paint dry. It moves very, very slowly. But you need to pay attention to it. Currently, I'm probably about 44%, 45% in stocks and 55% in bonds. So I will rebalance, and my RMD will probably come out of bonds when, the next year comes and I have to take an RMD or whatever like that. But I kind of keep it in that range. So just because it gets to 51%, I don't call Vanguard and say, oh, rebalance mine. I have that window because I don't think you should need to be that vigilant. You can let it drift within the 10% range. Okay? And I like this study because it was Franklin Templeton, and what they did, it was a very complicated chart. And what you can do is you can break asset classes down into all these different things, like small cap value, small cap growth, mid cap value, mid cap growth, large cap value, large cap growth, high yield bonds, intermediate term bonds, short term bonds. You can take all these different things, and there was all these different boxes. But basically what investment community does is it tracks the returns of all these different asset classes. And there's a whole bunch of them. And so they did a study, and they looked at the returns each year from the top to the bottom. Okay? So if you put $10,000 into the top performing asset every year. So let's say this year it's small cap growth. There's a top. So you put your $10,000. Next year, let's say it's large cap value. And then the year after, it's intermediate term bonds. Whatever. You get what my point is, you're always putting $10,000 each year for 20 years into the top performing asset. How did you do? Time period was 2010. Well, your $200,000 invested, because you did it for 20 years, it would have grown to $716,000, average return of 11.4 over this time period. But instead of doing that, let's say you took your $10,000 and the worst performing asset every year. You put it in the worst performing asset every year for that 20-year period, investing $200,000. Your actual return was $794,000. You outperformed by almost 1%. Let's say you allocated the $10,000 equally into all asset classes. You diversified as if you were indexing and just indexed your portfolio between stocks and bonds. Your $200,000 invested grew to almost $1 million. So diversification, indexing. So just a thought. So basically, the principles of asset allocation are, and by the way, my chart is ripped because the dog bit it. You notice a little chunk over here? I had the dogs in the car. Unfortunately, I had my charts in the back there, and I noticed that they were chewing away there, little white stuff in there. Well, we got the corner here. History shows that risk and return are related. The longer an investor's holding period, the lower the risk of investing. Rebalancing is also something to do to reduce risk. And distinguish between your attitude towards and your capacity for risk. Those are things you need to think about and answer. I rest my case. Questions? I hope you can see that being an effective manager of your money, from the past lessons I just talked to now, and doing it effectively, does not entail a tremendous amount of effort and work on your part. It requires some knowledge. You need to have knowledge to increase your tolerance for risk. You need to have patience. You need to have faith, and faith comes from information. The more information you are, the more you can have faith in what you're doing. But simply understanding that when you have low costs and you're using tax shelters like IRAs, 401ks, or you're using index funds outside in personal accounts, and you're using, I'll talk next week about maybe tax managed funds, or using municipal bond funds for bonds in your personal accounts, getting your portfolio tax efficient. And you can be as simple as using a total stock market index fund and a high quality bond fund, whether it be intermediate term bonds or short term bonds, and they're high quality depending on where you are in the interest rate cycle. And asset allocation, anyone can do this, in my opinion. You can really do this. But if you don't put the effort in to learn, then you're going to be jerked around by emotions, and you're going to fail. You are. You're not going to tolerate. You're going to be like the investors. The more volatile it was, the more they panicked, the more they pulled money out and then put it back in at the wrong time. You've got to be patient, stay the course. If the course is solid and fundamentally right, then you stay the course. And you can't invest as if it's a contest. Because there's always someone that's got a story about how much better they did than you. There's always going to be someone that's done better than you. Well, whoopee-doo. While you were slaving over the computer, looking at that, I was out golfing. You know what I mean? While you were rustling during a bear market, rolling in your sleep, I was cutting the Z's like a little baby. Because I have faith in what I'm doing, and it's performed as I've expected over all these different market cycles. So any questions? Did you get an understanding of ETFs better now? Because you were talking about that? Well, the capital gains, the things with ETFs are very capital gain efficient. If you don't trade them, in other words, you buy them and you hold them. They're very, very. The capital gains you would potentially have would be, let's say you're in an ETF and all of a sudden they decide they're going to kick this particular stock out and move this particular into the index, and maybe they have a capital gain that could get distributed to you, or the dividends get distributed to you. But generally, they try to keep them very tax efficient. They are very tax efficient vehicles. Unfortunately, many of the people who use them, I read about one particular ETF where the average holding period is 3 days. So, obviously, you're creating a lot of short-term capital gains if you're buying and selling it and turning it like that in, turnover. Because turnover is going to be, you buy and sell them in short periods, you're a short-term capital gain. Even if you hold them a year, then it's a one-term, a long-term capital gain. But, yeah, they do serve as a vehicle. One financial planner I talked to, that was his way of providing his expertise to his clients and create portfolios at lower costs. Because he understood the costs of mutual funds, and he could basically charge his clients like 1% a year, create a portfolio of ETFs with like 4 or 5 basis points of expenses. So his clients were basically getting his services and the investments with a total of the 1 to 1%, which is, pretty darn reasonable. And that's what he does with his clients. So, I have friends that are financial planners, and many of them are very conscious of managing expenses for their clients. So they're not my enemy. I remember one time I did a class, it was at the senior center here, and I remember walking out to the car, and there's a woman that, she had come to many of the classes. She was a very sweet woman. I haven't seen her for a while, but she came up to me and she said, she prays for me all the time. And I said, well, that's really sweet. She said, because I think someone's going to put a hit out on you. She was serious. She was worried but it was so sweet that, and I love people praying for me. Okay, any other questions? All right. We'll see you next week. Thank you.